This week, the New York Times announced that it was cracking down on the use of anonymous sources. If that has a familiar ring, there's a reason. The Times has thrown down the same gauntlet many times over the years. In a tongue-in-cheek tweet this week, outgoing New York Times public editor Margaret Sullivan said the paper has a new policy for anonymous attribution, citing newsroom sources who asked to remain nameless to avoid career suicide. Meanwhile, Sullivan herself has made something of a career out of calling out the use of anonymous sources. 2 years ago, she developed AnonWatch to point out when the Times was in violation of its own standards. This latest Times crackdown comes after 2 anonymously sourced stories turned out to be wrong. One contending a criminal probe into Hillary Clinton's use of emails, and another about one of the San Bernardino shooters' use of social media. A memo to the Times staff from executive editor Dean Baquet reads in part, "The use of anonymous sources is sometimes crucial to our journalistic mission, but it also puts a strain on our most valuable and delicate asset, our trust with readers." Baquet's lengthy note says anonymity should be a last resort, like, say, the Watergate tipster.
I wouldn't quote you even as an anonymous source. I mean, you'd be on deep background.
Meanwhile, Dean Baquet reiterated that faceless sources are among the paper's biggest reader complaints. I don't know. I mean, they've tried and tried and tried, and I'm sure the Globe has done the same thing. But one of the most important things I think Dean Baquet said is that oftentimes you're protecting somebody with an agenda, and that's the only reason why they don't want to go on the record. And that's why they're saying, you know, they really need to be more transparent, that the person who's giving you which clearly was the case in both the Hillary email thing. I don't know about the social media thing with the San Bernardino shooter, but there's an agenda, there's a mission, there's a point. They also are insisting that at least one editor be told who the anonymous source is, exactly what they said, and what their position in the whole deal is.
Which apparently is a policy they've had for a while, and they haven't enforced it very well. So good for them for enforcing it. You know what was absolutely hilarious about this? This week, the same week that the new policy was announced, the Times ran a story based on anonymous sources reporting that President Obama had told his supporters it's time to get behind Hillary Clinton. And then immediately Obama's spokesman, Josh Earnest, comes out and says, no, it never happened. And again, the Times ends up looking like, well, who's telling the truth here? Exactly. Because their sources were not on the record. By the way, a tiny bit about Margaret Sullivan, who I have praised over and over on this show. I'm amazed that the Times is continuing to let her continue as the public editor and snark at the Times while she gets ready to move to the Washington Post in order to be their media columnist. To me, that doesn't make any sense.
Well, good for them.
I would say it's interesting that a lot of the focus has been on a couple of high-profile mistakes at the Times, which I think are problematic. In a way, the larger issue with anonymous sources is in a lot of more day-to-day reporting in a lot of other publications. It makes sense to have a policy where you allow anonymous sources if there are facts that are material that you cannot get otherwise, and you do your best to identify where the facts came from and why the person is giving them to you. The existence of an anonymous source as an option leads a lot of people in politics, in lots of other places, to try to drive a truck, essentially, through that loophole and be quoted anonymously in a lot of situations where they could just as easily go on the record. And it's really strange to see politicians who have a phalanx of public relations people, and then you hear from these people, well, I want to be quoted, but only without attribution. It's a little strange.
What I loved about this story is that I think there's this fundamental incoherence to what the Times is allegedly doing. On the one hand, as you mentioned in the piece, they are reiterating that anonymous sources are only to be used as a last resort. But then the policy articulated by Dean Baquet goes on to basically say how anonymous sources should be handled when they're used not as a last resort. You got to check with one of the top 3 editors at the paper if it is the core of the story. But if it's not the core of the story, if it's sort of an ancillary thing, then the protocol's a little looser. They can't make up their mind. They still can't make up their mind.
I don't get why they can't make up their mind around following what Dante said around basic stuff. Because you see stories where they say, it's alleged that Dante buys his tie. Okay, why is that an anonymous source? I don't get that. So if they were just to take out those ridiculousness, which any editor can see, okay, you don't need me to tell you if it's alleged, I mean, unless you're dealing with the mob for your ties, why is that a part of the story? I don't get it. And save it for those other things where they really need to tell their editors where I got this from and whatever. I just don't, that's so obvious to me. If they just cut that out, they'd be ahead of the game.
One of the things you also noticed the last time they revised this policy that they wanted to include a reason for why anonymous sourcing was being used. And you could see just over the course of months and years that policy being watered down over time. You know, initially it would say someone who didn't give their name because it is illegal for them to, to disclose the information. And then later it will say because of the sensitivity of the material.
Yeah.
I mean, they might as well, because he didn't really feel like it.
Yeah.
And eventually we may reach that point with this new policy.
Yeah.
You know, the other thing too is I think it's a good idea to try to minimize the use of anonymous sources. At the same time, there's an argument to be made that if you can publish true information because of anonymous sources, why are you feeling like there's something a little bit dirty about it? I mean, even on some of these more trivial things.
I'm agreeing with you on not on the trivial things. Come on, Dan.
But I mean, if it's true and it's interesting,
that's
why
not because if the Times sets itself up as the newspaper of record, the gold standard, then follow the rules of the gold standard. Do the shoe leather work that you're known to do, we're told, and don't, skimp on that. Save your ammunition for stuff.
Were you going somewhere else with that?
I, as the news consumer, no, I'm just saying, I as a news consumer, then pay attention when you have an anonymous source on a very serious story. If you're telling me about Dante's ties off the side, I just don't care anymore because I don't believe any of this stuff at this point. I have to question it.
Do you want
that
to come
makes
clean about
no
your ties?
sense.
I do have my ties
I got to
from
get
the
a
mob,
look at this
so-
tie.
All right.
Finally, it's
Very
out.
nice tie.